So good afternoon. So I'm going to wander a little bit. I'm a wanderer. I don't stand well behind lecterns, and I'll actually come down and chat with some of you in a minute. I want to sort of go back to, Todd, something you just said, which is the name of our firm, 6 words. White men as full diversity partners. I want you to pretend for a second you're me and you're on an airplane and you sit down next to your seatmate and up comes sometimes the usual question like, what do you do for a living? So I have a really interesting choice point. I can choose to say something benign like I am organizational development, leadership consultant, and I work on issues of cultural competency, blah, blah, blah. And that's sort of benign left alone. But if I lead with, I'm the co-founder and CEO of a firm called White Men as Full Diversity Partners, about 80% of the time that ends the conversation right there. I mean, it's just over. It's just over. And I can see the wheels turning for some folks. And one of the wheels that turns up is, so are you like a neo-Nazi support group, for this unfortunate incident that just happened up the road a little bit? So, or the other end of that continuum is, you must go around in corporations and do frontal lobotomies on white guys that are clueless around the issue of inclusion and diversity. Do you do that? So those two poles are pretty drastic and pretty not really what we're about. So how did we get there? 40 years ago, I was doing leadership work. I was actually just north of here in North Carolina, working for Outward Bound. I was engaged in working with youth and adults around the whole process of personal development through physical challenge and other sorts of things. And I was totally oblivious to the parallel universe that was operating around me related to how my identity as a white, straight, male, temporarily able-bodied, Christian, U.S. citizen, English-speaking, at that point, young person, how all of those identities, and particularly not just my identities, but the identities of other people that I was in sort of orbit with, I was oblivious to. And I viewed myself, as probably all of you do, as a well-intended lover of justice and equity and just a really nice, good guy. And then in 1987, at the urging of a colleague with a professional association I was involved with, I was on a planning committee like Nika and others were with this session. And when you're doing that, you don't get to a lot of the events. But at an urging of a colleague, I went to a 2-hour workshop called Celebrating Differences Through Building Alliances, led by a man from the Bay Area named Harrison Sims. And Harrison sort of opened that door to this parallel universe for me, which had always been around me, but I'd never seen it. And then started a 10-year glide path where over that 10 years, I started to do cultural competency. But as you can well imagine, I didn't believe in my ability to do that work because who was I? I'm just a white guy. I don't know this. And I was noticing the same dynamic where when I was paired up with a colleague of color or a white female colleague, the teams I was working with would always defer the issue of inclusion to my colleague. And it wasn't malicious, it wasn't ill-intended, it wasn't even conscious, but I was noticing this pattern. And then I noticed another interesting pattern. And the pattern that I noticed, that the same dynamic was happening actually on that team, where the white men on that team, every time the issue of inclusion came up, always outsourced it in a very respectful, almost unconscious way to anybody else on the team that didn't look like me or them. And I said, I don't know if inclusion and diversity, as I believe, or at least come to believe, is a leadership imperative. How is this sustainable if parts of leadership are always looking to others on the team, which is usually still, particularly in the realm I work in now, Fortune 500 companies, still the minority group and the marginalized groups. And they become the content experts. And many of you who are sitting in the audience have probably been on the receiving end of people like myself coming to you from a place of really positive intent like, hey, Dr. Charles, that was really great about what we learned, but by the way, what you told me to do, I tried to do it and it didn't work. Can you give me 3 new things to work on? As if somehow that's her job, is to educate, mentor, and coach me. So this picture is one of 300 groups over the last 20 years that our firm, and we don't just work with white men, so we'll touch on that in a second, but it was a way of saying I'm noticing a deficit where everyone else on the team is on point around the issue of inclusion except my group. And I said, we have some work to do with each other. And so in 1997, I piloted a 3.5-day residential workshop called intentionally a White Men's Caucus on eliminating racism, sexism, and homophobia in organizations. And of course, it's shortened to the White Men's Caucus. Now you can imagine, for those of you in the business realm, or actually any realm, telling your colleagues that you've been signed up to go to a diversity session called a White Men's Caucus. It feels like a little bit of an oxymoron, right? Or worse, because of that moniker of white men as those two front words, there's other things that are there. And so I want to sort of get with that for a second. So first I want to just say that this is really a journey of not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And so today, or at least for the next few minutes, I want to invite you to notice and explore and challenge the assumptions that you're going to find coming up, bubbling up, sort of as they have during the morning session, and certainly for me, during Dr. Charles' piece this morning. So just notice your assumptions, pay attention to them. Also, as you do that, listen to understand your colleagues as well as your perspective. Notice that does not say listen to agree. There is a plethora of perspectives on all of these topics, as there should be. That's the great diversity of thought and the way in which our identity and our past experience comes to have us see the same issue, but to interpret it so many different ways. Listening to understand for me is really challenging when what another person says is different from what I believe. And actually, from my humble experience in this country, one of my concerns in the last 10 years in particular is the way in which we've continued to sort of polarize. And I hang out with people who think like me, and I watch news programs that sort of interpret the news the way that I think. And then for sport on social media, we seem to sort of can't help ourselves but by demonizing the other who has a different perspective. And then we all feel more informed because we have these things in our pockets that we can carry around, when really I feel like I'm less informed and I'm more sheltered because I just hang out with the people that agree with me. Thirdly, my experience around many of these topics is I have been taught to look at them from an either-or lens. It's a 1 or a 0. It's a yes or a no. Do I open the door for my female colleague? Do I not open the door? Do I call you black or African American? What is the rule? When in reality, as Dr. Charles, you said so eloquently this morning a number of times, it is in the eye of the beholder, my words, about how they define who they are and how no two of us are identical. So the and both, when we're looking at the same issue and someone says, it looks like we need to go left, and someone else says we need to go right. It's yes and yes. How could that be in a world that's oftentimes very binary? Thirdly, pay attention to what you are surprised by, even mildly irritated. I would say I'm hoping, as I'm hoping this whole day is for many of us, my role here is a little positive provocation. I want to provoke. I want to push you. I want to challenge you and I to not say our perspective of the world is wrong, but it's likely incomplete. And then, lastly, pay attention to permission to basically accept or reject anything I certainly say. This is not, we all have to be into the same path, in the same boat, in the same, hopefully, the similar direction. So your perspective, again, is as valid as mine or anybody else's in the room. So I want to move here, and I want to start, I need your help. And I'd like you to do a little free association. And I'd like you to free associate on the two words white men, and I'd like you just to call out what comes top of mind without censoring it, and I'm going to sort of repeat it back so the rest of the room can see. So, white men, anybody as I'm walking over here? Can't jump. Thank you. White men? Privileged. White men? Power. White men? False. Boss, thank you, boss. White men. Conservative, white men. Free associate, what pops into your mind? Oblivious, white men, thank you. Selfish, no rhythm, white men. Microaggressions, white men. Love football. A couple more, well, we've got to give this half of the room a little their due. White men? Privilege. White men. Fraternities. White men. C-suite. Entitled. Thank you. White men. Boys club. A couple more up front here. White men. Old money. CEO? Dad? Insecure. Let's end there. Family-oriented. Well, let's end with that. So first of all, thank you for taking me at my word, free associating, just sort of what's top of mind. So now, in the spirit of courage, if you're white and male and you're willing, could you please stand up? If you're white and male, could you please stand up? So all in the room, I just want you to notice sort of what's going on, and I'm going to invite those standing, if you wish, to just share what did you notice, what are you noticing in the way of a feeling right now as you and your colleagues were participating in my request to free associate around these two words. So please. Felt bashed. Thank you. Someone else, what did you notice that you were feeling? Stereotype. Thank you. Someone else, what did you notice that you were feeling? Misunderstood. Thank you. What else? Anything else you noticed you were feeling? Sounded about right. Thank you. Other things, a couple other guys, what'd you notice? Any party? Minority, thank you. One more or two? It didn't apply to you. Thank you. So guys that were standing, first of all, thank you for standing up and bringing a face to this, and go ahead and have a seat. So I want to, again, permission to accept or reject. I want to suggest that little 4-minute exercise that we didn't just get created in the room. It's already here. It's latent. It's in the subcontext of how we sort of bump into each other and ourselves. It's the notion about identity that Dr. Charles spoke to, in terms of, for me, the privilege of basically forgetting that I actually have multiple identities, and that I walk through this world lots of times just thinking I'm Bill. And why is everybody so angry at me? When it's really not about me. It actually becomes about me when I start to lead with that over and over. I also want to say to the white men that stood, first of all, I want to thank you for being here. Someone asked me today, so what have you noticed in 30 years of this work around progress? 30 years ago, I could count on one, maybe two hands, the number of straight Christian white men that I knew of in the US that were doing cultural competency work. I wouldn't call us sort of a large group these days, but the number has grown. And I'm also, when I come to diversity events like this and inclusion events, it is comforting for me to see white men in the audience at a session on inclusion and diversity. So again, just notice that the mindset and assumption that you and I hold, and there are a plethora of mindsets that you and I hold, some of them are similar, many of which are different, impact the way that we think and behave. And my rhetorical question this afternoon is for all of us to notice, what is your mindset about diversity and inclusion when you bring the group of white men, and I might even qualify that further and say straight white men, into the conversation? And then what do we do with that? So coming back to our firm, we don't just work with white men, we work with leaders. And we work with leaders on 3 levels: to grow courage, to grow competency, and to grow consciousness. Leaders of all genders and all gender identity and all ethnicities and nationalities are tasked with an increasingly complex role of how to figure out how to have their employee base and their direct reports feel valued, heard, and respected so that they can achieve their results and address their bottom line however they wish to measure that. And in this day and age, this is some of the Mercer studies and other things globally right now, we're seeing a set of characteristics about what is needed for future leadership that are much more descriptive of what have been typically seen as feminine qualities: empathy, intuition. And in reality is that feminine qualities exist in both men and women across the whole gender continuum, just as they exist in all of us. But notice how my own conditioning, when we did the mask exercise, one of the things I wrote was, my own conditioning has impacted how I think what I'm capable of doing and what I'm not capable of doing. So I spent the first 30 years of my life doing really good work, but totally oblivious of my identity and how that preceded me wherever I went. And so when you don't know Bill and you see Bill now as I got called old white guy for the first time about 9 months ago. I'm like, who are you talking to? I said, who is that? But you see an old, sort of grizzly bearded, big white guy. Your experience with my group may precede you knowing me. And if I am not aware of that, I don't need to know the full story, but if I'm not aware of that, it can really start to impact our potential partnership. Because I'm now hearing it as, why are you reacting to me, Bill? And so I've learned to ask, not all the time, but a lot of times, where on the continuum are you speaking to me from? And it's not necessarily sometimes this direct. Are you talking to me as the current representative of a group of white men that you've had experience with? Are you talking to me as Bill, or are you talking to me somewhere in between? Because I want to know from where to listen to you from. And to be able to let you know that if you're talking to me as the current representative of a group and you've had less than positive experience with, I want you to know that I can stand in the fire, and it's my job not to get burned. Right? Not about you need to dial it back because I'm feeling uncomfortable, or why are you sort of attacking me again, or why are you projecting onto this, I'm a good guy, or all of that's not said, but it's sort of thought. So how do we hang in there with each other for the resilience and the perseverance that our partnerships demand, particularly in this time and day, not just in a business context, but on a globe that's in desperate need of partnership and connection, so that we can be there for each other, rather than just there when we think we need someone who sort of looks like us. So what should you know about this group? Now I'm gonna take the risk of wading into a generalization about an entire group of people, some of which are represented in the room. But again, from 30 years of work, here's some of what I've learned that I think it's important for you to know, particularly if you're interested in partnerships with white men in your life, personally or professionally. First of all, we're not all the same. We're not a monolith. It's just like no other person represents their group. Notice, though, the privilege that I have lots of times, it's very rare that someone assumes that I'm speaking for all white men. So I'm given the privilege of speaking just for Bill. When what happened recently in Las Vegas that was just heartbreaking, I didn't worry in the hours after that happened if that shooter was going to look like me or not. He did look like me. He does look like me. I'm not worried about where I go and what I do. Same thing happened 20 years ago in Oklahoma City when Tim McVeigh did what he did at the Federal Building. And the next day I went to the Ryder truck rental place to rent a truck to take my son's stuff to college. I wasn't worried about being seen and targeted as a terrorist. So we're not all the same. We also have a culture, and I think this is a really interesting one, because my experience, particularly in the US, when we think about culture and cultural competency, lots of times we always think about every other group has a culture. What's the black culture in this part of the US? How is it different from where I live in Portland, Oregon? What's the Latino culture? What's the Asian culture? White men, we have a culture, and it looks different as we go around this country. But there is a culture. That culture has impact on my behavior, my values, and my beliefs. One of the examples of that culture is I was acculturated growing up as a little boy to basically act like you know what you're talking about. I call it acquired male answer syndrome. If asked a definitive question, I've learned to give a definitive answer whether I know what I'm talking about or not. And I do it with unconscious ease, and my family then has to point out to me, oh, Dad, you don't know that, or Grandpa, you don't know that. You're just making that up. But part of that has been tied to my thinking that's what being a competent adult's supposed to look like. I'm supposed to know. And to show any chinks in the armor, that sense of vulnerability has been drilled into me. That's weakness, that's weakness, that's weakness. And it's taken me the last 30 years to recognize, no, that's strength. To be able to stand and watch courageous leaders, male or female, white, black, brown, or Asian, to be able to stand and say, I don't know, when asked the question, but let's go find out. We're also like fish in water, because in many organizations, many of which are probably represented in this room, particularly in the senior leadership, we still represent the numerical majority for reasons that I'm still yet to fully understand, but I'm working on it, is that we're the last to know that we have a culture because everybody else is constantly coming in and having to be bicultural or multicultural to fit into my world. So I didn't realize I had a culture until at age 16 I had the privilege of being a Rotary Exchange student and spending a year in New Zealand, where I'm heading in 2 weeks to go see some friends that I haven't seen for quite some time. It became really clear to me that I had a culture from the suburbs of Pennsylvania outside of Philly, where I grew up as a child of the 60s. that before that time it was invisible to me. I sort of had somewhat of a picture of everybody else's culture. So fish sometimes don't know they're in water because if they leave the water, it's not sort of good for the fish's health. Fortunately, I'm not a fish, so I can leave my culture. When I leave my culture, I get to see it better. We also, many of us don't realize the privilege that my white skin color or my maleness affords me. And by privilege, I'm talking about the unacknowledged, invisible, often invisible benefits that come to me simply because of the membership in that group, not because of my innate ability and virtue. It's not, benefits is a tough word. It's not so much what I have, it's what I don't have to think about or navigate or negotiate. So when I have a bad day on airline travel, and I have a bad experience at the customer service rep, I never attribute that to I'm a large bearded white guy, this must be happening to me because of that. I just say they need some customer service refresher. My partner of 25 years, who has experienced a very different collective experience when dealing with travel folks, she says, when we're traveling together, I want you to lead the conversation because we're going to get a different and a better level of service. And I still don't see it. And you can imagine, I sometimes, when I don't see it, I want to, because she's 31-year public school principal, incredibly gifted people leader. And I don't want to believe that that's actually her reality. And you can imagine that does not go well in our relationship when I tell her that must not be the case. So I don't, not believing her is not a good stance of partnership. Because I don't see it, that doesn't mean it's not happening for her. That's my work to do. This interesting one around my unconsciousness and my incompetence. I don't know that I don't know. For me, lots of times is a byproduct of being in the group that I got born into. That's not only the dominant group in many circumstances, but I call it's the insider group. We're the groups that have created a lot of the systems. It's not a bad thing, but it's just, I don't know that I don't know. So my unconscious incompetence, lots of times, my cluelessness gets confused as, Bill, I don't believe you. You're 62 years old, you're an accomplished professional, you're doing X, Y, and Z. I don't believe that that's just blissful ignorance. You must be doing this on purpose. And usually that exchange is not verbal. It's not as direct as I just sort of clarified. It's sort of thought, and that can blow up our partnership. So for me, becoming conscious of my incompetence has been more than a full-time job, because think about when you now are a visible, competent professional, regardless of your identities, and you're now aware of not knowing something, and you're going to be asked to speak to that publicly. Oh, I don't think so. So how do you hang in that space of not knowing and to see that in service to your learning and development as a partner? Not just for white men, but for all of us. This other one is that many white men, we appear anxious and or indifferent. Sometimes the indifference is the interpretation by others of our unconscious incompetence. The anxiousness is about, last time I checked, we've done a pretty good job in most systems of getting egregious behavior out of the system. And if not out, we have really good processes to sort of cut that off and remove it. So I'm not talking about egregious sort of misunderstanding. I'm talking about the things that I do from a place of positive intent that land on my colleague in a way that has a really negative, hurtful impact that I'm the last in the room to know, and sometimes don't know for months, if not years afterwards. And so that anxiousness about I don't want to say and do the wrong things, and can keep me and other white men silent when actually we need to be practicing and making mistakes and trying it out. And so what's our support system and safety net? Not just by having white women and men and women of color as our support net, but by having other white men, so that we can actually practice falling down metaphorically to get better at our inclusive partnerships. That takes rigor and perseverance. It just doesn't happen because we go to a really good inclusion summit like today. You got to practice this stuff over and over and over. And then lastly, most of us really want to be full and good diversity partners. Even sometimes our presenting behavior may indicate otherwise. And I'm not saying all the time. I was just with a group in Europe a week and a half ago, and we were doing 2 days of gender work. And the group, some of the men basically were really sort of poo-pooing the first day. We were doing a lot of sort of looking at culture and behavior and privilege and bias. And they said, yeah, a couple of them are from some of the Nordic countries, which actually from their stats and whatnot in the EU, are leading the world around, particularly gender equality. They said, we don't have these issues. We're a progressive company. So I sort of let that go. We fortunately have an incubator overnight. We come back the next morning, we start with a check-in, and there's 5 women in this team. This is an intact team. One of the women speaks up, and she said, we need to have a conversation. So she said, I'm going to share with you 2 or 3 stories of what's just I've been dealing with in the last month. She was in an HR function. And she told the story in this setting, in this system, of a gentleman, a leader, who was bringing a scale into work and having the women get on the scale and putting their weights up on the board. Right? And the guys were like, doing what you're doing. It's like, you got to be kidding me. And she said, want me to keep going? There's whole bunches of stories like this. My question was, that lots of times we focus on that egregious, really clear, like, I can't believe that's happening in 2017. My question is, what's been the glide path for that gentleman to spend the last 10 years thinking that he could get to the point where he could actually do that? And how did I collude, and other men in particular, collude by not actually speaking up? Or how do we contribute by the offhand comments that we've made with other men as a way of sort of bonding with the guys? And so what's our contribution to that, rather than seeing that as some aberration that is totally disconnected from the whole? Which then goes to a couple of things I want to leave you with before we do a couple of questions. And these are tips certainly for white men, but they could also be actually for all of us in the room. And in the materials online, there's some other tips that I put together. I'm just going to touch on 5 of them briefly. This is a piece of research that the organization Catalyst out of New York City, who's been around for 50 years, has done a lot of work around women's role in business. Study they did in 2009 about the role of men as visible gender equality champions and what gets in their way. And one of the barriers was apathy. And apathy is rooted in lack of understanding one's self-interest. And so part of that is, for me, the work continues, and for many other straight white men, how is the issue of inclusion impacting me, and what's my interest that is similar yet different to my colleagues of color, my female colleagues, my gay and trans and bisexual colleagues? How is it similar yet different, rather than thinking, I'm all on board, tell me what to do about this race thing, and then we'll deal with the gender thing and the sexual orientation thing, and maybe we'll get some other things. And by the way, I'm fatigued because what you told me last week didn't work. So what's my self-interest in that? I've got to continue to ask the question. I would ask you and invite you to also ask the question, what's in it for you to create a more inclusive culture, rather than your bottom line, which is a good start, but what's the personal interest to you? Secondly, and this came up in the session I just caught the last part of, we got to validate others' perspectives, particularly when we don't understand it or we don't agree with it. Think about that. It's easy for me to validate your perspective when we're in the same quadrant of the universe. It's much more challenging when we're in really different places. So how do we really validate? And it's not about I agree with you. It's like I want you to know that I heard you. I always ask my staff often, because I get this wrong all the time, how do you know you've been heard by me? How do you know that? And it's not their job to sort of be my full-time coach, but I got to ask myself that question. How do I know others are hearing me? Am I present? Does this thing sort of come in and sort of take over my life and make me just sort of try to be a multitasking sort of maniac? 3, stories. We can argue about data, as we've seen in our country, and facts and other things. We can't invalidate our story. Each of us has a complex story which is unique from anybody else. Your story and my story is central to how I'm showing up in this moment and how you're showing up as well in partnership. So tell me about the story. How much time do we have? So let me tell a little story before we'll get into Q&A. So I had the really great pleasure of working in organizational systems, a couple of them for the last 10 years. One of them is Rockwell Automation. They're a Milwaukee-based global company. They just won the Catalyst Award this year. I'd like to think that we're a good partner with them in doing that. But there's a gentleman there, his name's Lee Shantz, and I use his name with permission, and I tell this story with his permission, who for about 9 years, ran North American sales for this organization. Now, this is an engineering organization that probably at Michelin and some of the other companies here that have manufacturing lines, they are in those manufacturing lines with software and other things. So it's a really big company that's not it's not a public commodity. You don't really hear about them very much. And Lee said to me, he said from his work of 8 years, he had a gentleman in his organization who happened to be black. He happened to grow up in Georgia. And Lee had this mindset of saying it was really important that people manage down, across, and manage up. And he'd say that a lot. And he went to this gentleman one day that he'd known for 20 years. So this is not just a new acquaintance. He'd known this gentleman, black gentleman, for 20 years. And he said to this man, he said, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to have a conversation with me about what it's like for you as a black man working in our company. And this gentleman was a little bit sort of taken aback because it's not a question he'd ever been asked in his years at Rockwell. But because of that connection and Lee's genuine interest that he perceived, he started to say, well, Lee, he said, Lee, I've heard you say for a number of times, manage across, manage down, manage up. And he said, until you just mentioned it right now, I think I've really struggled with managing up. And he said, I never even thought about this. I didn't put it together until just now. I think when I grew up, my father and other men and adult men in my life, basically as a black man growing up in the South in the 60s, said, you don't look white men, older white men in the eye. It's going to get you hurt. And he said, I think in some way, unconsciously, I've carried that into my professional life, and that part of my struggle is not directly related to that, but it's definitely connected to that. And Lee, whose mouth was then sort of open, asked a really important question at this point. He asked, what, if anything, would you like me to do about that? Rather than saying, here's what we're going to do. Move it to fix it, as if somehow he can. And the gentleman said, I don't know. But talking about it and being able to bring voice to it is enormously helpful. So I'd love the opportunity anytime to be able to pick up the phone or be able to just talk about it. Lee said, you got it. I said, that's a simple way of which we build partnership. Asking a question and then waiting to hear the answer rather than sort of filling in the answer. 4, this is an interesting one. I've grown up in a culture that largely focused on seeing sameness. And I've said this, as many other people. I said, early on, I said, I don't see your skin color, I don't see your gender, I just want to treat everybody the same. Anybody ever even heard that said or said that themselves? I don't see skin color and gender, I just want to treat everybody the same. My experience, there's a positive intent behind that. I want to see the person standing in front of me, right? It took me about 20 years and about 200 different times to understand that when I said that, that impacted people saying, Bill, what I hear from you is I got to fit into your life. I've got to look like you, impossible to do, act like you, contribute like you, show up like you. I can't be myself. When I said, So this notion about how do you manage simultaneously noticing sameness, how we're connected inherently, and how we're infinitely always different in the same breath, like we're breathing air. If you don't believe that's possible, go watch a 6 or 7-year-old interacting if there's not an adult nearby. Kids are brilliant at being able to see sameness and difference in the same breath. In and out, not a big deal. Notice how lots of times we've focused on one end of that continuum at the expense of the other. And you can do the same thing by focusing only on difference and not seeing commonality. How do you do both? And how do you do that porously without it trivializing, whatever that word is? Last thing before we take some questions. This one is a really important one. It has been a really important one for me and many of the other white men I've had the privilege to work with. What we're dealing with, not just in this country at this time, but on this globe, the systemic systems of oppression that continue to marginalize groups of people simply because of where they were born or the color or shade of their skin or their gender or their ideology or who they choose to love. There's this notion lots of times is that privilege has been used as a blunt instrument by those of us that have it in those dominant groups, in those insider groups. At the college campus, check your privilege, which I actually personally have problems with in the sense in terms of how that's used as a blunt instrument. So this is not your or my fault, this condition that we've inherited. And it is your and my responsibility to understand how issues of race and racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, ageism, et cetera, how that is impacting how I'm hearing you in this moment and how you're hearing me. And for me to not understand that and to put that onto the shoulders of you to have to manage that dynamic between the two of us is not part of the partnership deal that I want to sign up for any further. So it's my work to understand how is that showing up. Not just across difference, but within perceived sameness. So I'm working with other straight white men. How have we been conditioned to sort of keep each other at arm's length? Don't let us see us sweat, show no chinks in the armor. Certainly don't be vulnerable with one another. So I would say I love the opportunity to be able to work, as many of probably you do, that really calls to my heart. And I would say 30 years into my work, I am more confused now about many of these topics than I was 30 years ago when I was blissfully having a very nice life, totally asleep at the wheel. So embracing confusion and uncertainty is another tool that has been enormously helpful. My curiosity before used to run into the dead end of, because I don't know, I got to go to the next class or read the book. I got to get certain. I got to figure this out. I said, no, I don't. I'm going to go the rest of my life, or how many days I have here, I'm going to continue to not know a lot of things about you and others. My confusion can drive and should drive my curiosity. So instead of being afraid of what I don't know, when I don't know something, it's an invitation to go towards that rather than away from it. I also want to recognize for me as a large, white, able-bodied, heterosexual male, that is a privilege in itself to be able to move to the things that I'm anxious about. And I don't take that for granted. So I want to close with this before we do some questions. A colleague of mine who's actually also an elected official in the state of Idaho, she's the first and only elected black official in Idaho. Cherie Buckner Webb is in the Idaho State Senate presently. She was once a client of ours at Hewlett-Packard years ago, and she said, Bill, I'm not asking you to give up your white male privilege. It's impossible for you to do. I want you to learn to notice it and then learn to use it honorably. And the learning to use it honorably has been a really helpful mental reframe for me about what does it mean in this moment for me to notice and use my privilege honorably, whatever that privilege is, rather than to run from it or to try to give it to somebody else or to pretend like I don't have it. So let's take some questions or some commentary, and thank you very much.
So this was brilliant, and I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to try to focus on one. A few other reflections that I had from this session was when all of the white males stood up, it was interesting how some of the stereotypes that we gave in response to your question, they said that they felt bashed, stereotyped, looking at the others, does not apply, misunderstood. Someone said it was right. Those are the same things that others in minority groups feel. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, oh my gosh, if we could just find that connection,
yes.
If we can find that way to connect, because that's a lot of the way that we feel. The other item that you mentioned that stood out was about bombings and how after what happened in Oklahoma City and what happened in Las Vegas, you didn't have to worry about being judged, but Middle Eastern folks did after 9/11. Muslims did. So it's all of these things that I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, others do have to walk in and they do have to worry about that they're going to be targeted. So my question to you, because I just love your work, and thank you, first and foremost, for your partnership. What can we do to help bring people along without it feeling coerced? So it's voluntary, but we can find a way to seek to understand and meet in the middle, because it can't be something that's forced.
Yeah, I appreciate the question is a huge question, right? And I think, Dr. Charles, when you kicked it off this morning, a lot of what I heard from you really resonated for me around our work together. And our work is separate and it's together. It's never ending. And I think part of that is to get out of the notion that this is a problem, that racism is a problem that has a fix-it point where we end it. And I don't mean to say we're just going to just throw, oh, it's just the way that it is. We have to learn to live with that. No, I don't, and no, you don't. It's a condition. I've inherited a lot of misinformation about myself and other people as a result of that. So by being curious and noticing when I'm bumping into my misinformation or my bias or my, and not just about race, it could be about anything. For me, it's the one right now, the cockpit door of the aircraft opens and out comes the female pilot. I'm noticing a surprise, even though intellectually I know women fly commercial and military planes and jets, but it's telling me that I've got something connected up here saying that's the man's job. So it's just perseverance, hanging in there. It's saying, yeah, I fell down today. Could you lend me a hand? Or I pushed you down unintentionally. I'm so sorry. Can we, you may or may not want to talk with me. And when you don't want to talk with me, that's got to be okay for me. Rather than, you make me feel okay about it. Make me feel comfortable. So I don't know that that's an answer, but just sort of perseverance, hanging in there with each other. And we all have work to do. My experience is that when I and other white men do our work, which for lots of reasons we've not had to look at for many decades in this country, it actually gives my colleagues of color, my white female colleagues, an opportunity to actually look at some of their collusion that they've not been able to look at because they've taken me on as a full-time reclamation project or other white men. And so changing that dynamic, we all have work to do. Sometimes it overlaps and intersects, and other times it's very different. Which is why with employee resource groups, I'm a big proponent of those. I just saw that Deloitte, I think, who they admire, they're an industry leader, are now, I think, sunsetting their ERGs, and there's lots of times they're seen as divisive. I'm not commenting on Deloitte because I don't know enough about that. My notion about it, it's important to have sanctity and comfort of similarity at times. And if I get all weirded out about that, that's my work to deal with my reaction to that rather than saying, let's do away with these groups. Because these are divisive in my eyes. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your insight and your presentation. It was very powerful. My name is Dominique Milton, and I'm in the Riley Institute of Diversity and Inclusion this year's class. And it's more of a statement than a question, but we were in class together, we watched the movie Crash,
yeah.
And we dissected the movie. And after we dissected the movie, one of the class participants, she said, what is white privilege, and why is it bad? So I was really surprised when she asked the question because I thought everybody understood and knew what it was. But
courageous question for her to ask, right?
So, but I told her, I said it's not bad. It's unconscious privilege is what's bad, and when you're not aware of it. So I just want to make that statement because there are people who are not aware of their privilege, and we need to have these conversations so that everybody is understanding what that privilege is and how we address it, much to what you spoke.
Yeah, and for me, it's sort of get away from what I'm projecting onto the word privilege as good or bad. It's just, it is.
Right.
And it's stuff that I don't have to negotiate and think about oftentimes. It doesn't make me a bad person, doesn't make me less. For a lot of white men, I'm saying this is not about you haven't struggled or you're not toiling or you haven't worked hard, because lots of times they hear you got privilege as you cut and you didn't have to do anything, you got right to the front of the line. And that's the and bothness of it. Absolutely, I and other white men have struggled and continue to struggle. And we're all different. So sometimes there's an economic class difference where a white male might be like 2 paychecks away from being on the street if he loses his ability to be employed. But yet he still has skin color preference and privilege and male privilege. They don't mutually exclude each other. That's a tough one to get over because we have a tendency to set up oppression as a hierarchy. And the oppression that a person feels, if that's their presenting major issue, that's the most important thing in their life. And who is it for me or someone else to say, well, this is more important than that other thing? So thank you for that. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Smith, and I'm a consultant. And I want to ask a question about one of the points in your slide where you talked about the majority of white men want to buy in and believe in diversity. And I'm wondering if that is any different post-election 2016, whereas I do a lot of work with young white males, college campuses, and corporate offices. And what I keep hearing them say is they're tired of diversity. They want their country back, and they don't want to deal with this anymore.
Yeah, well, appreciate you being on the front lines of that one. I do not mean to politicize the word, but my notion is that politics are in everything. And so, again, if you disagree with what I'm about to say, just chalk it up to us living in this great country, right? Make America great again, in the eyes of whom, and for what? And so for me, growing up as a child of the 60s, where I was one of 500 kids in my class that have 5 students of color, And I just reconnected recently with one of the African American women that I went to school with. She's an attorney, very successful attorney up in the Philly area now. And we had a conversation because we're going to potentially do some work together next year. And I said, Sheila, I said, what was it like for you when we were in high school together? And she just started down, like she said, how much time do you have? And she started down the list of what it was for her as a black woman in 1971 and 72. And this was like, oh, didn't see that. I don't even remember that. And I remember reading about everything that was happening around me in our country, and I was in a little bubble. And I think part of that was the privilege of sort of saying, because this did not impact me personally, I could read about it and then just sort of forget about it. So I think what comes around goes around, right? This work we're never done with it. Also, I thought you were headed with, when you said younger people, there's also a notion about younger people are really tired of people my age from the boomer generation continuing to sort of do this diversity stuff because they don't have those issues and they've got lots of their colleagues and they're not sort of judging people based on sexual orientation. And yes, some of that fortunately is going on. I watch my own adult kids having a very different sort of growing up relationship than I did when I was that age. And we've done a couple of experiments in the corporate sector. We've taken early career white men in particular for 3.5 days, and the issues are almost identical. So it's yes, it's changing, and no, it's not, because lots of times these early professionals are learning about the culture from the people that are my age that are exiting, and culture gets passed along. And it's also, culture is not static, it's constantly shifting. So the good news is, because it's constantly shifting, I have great hope, not just at the corporate level, but at the global level. With Mayor Knox, what you're doing in your city, I can only imagine is in the city that I live in, about being able to create coalitions of people that are broad spectrums of very difference, and to see, trying to find the common good, which is, for elected officials, is nothing short of a small miracle. I am saddened that public service has become almost a 4-letter word, and I really implore the young people in my life, my grandkids, to get engaged, because the democratic process doesn't work if we don't have people willing to run for elected office. So those of you that are serving in public service places, I appreciate your service. And I particularly appreciate when I don't agree with your policy. Especially appreciate that. Thank goodness we live in a country where we can disagree that way. How much we doing? A couple more? Another question?
So, hi, I'm Megan. I'm feeling like, so between this morning's wonderful presentation and this, I'm feeling a little conflicted, so I'm hoping you could give some guidance. So when you say things like, you know, that person asking that question is courageous. Yeah, so, okay, it's courageous. But I feel a little bit like sometimes the praise of even asking that question angers me further, right?
Yes.
Like, so that's like, for me, I was feeling like, you know, my husband gets praised when he stays at home with the kid.
Yeah,
And
sort of a Renaissance
and it's
father.
frustrating. But if I do it, it's like, oh, she's just the wife.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so it's a similar feeling for me. But so how do you go about still being your authentic self while also keeping or getting even men in the room? And when I say that, I also want to acknowledge that it's not just white men that are the problem.
Yeah.
There's also very much white women. So how do you balance those two things?
Well, first of all, I would say you do what you just did. You speak up, you notice how, in the example you gave, your husband gets sort of rewarded as a Renaissance guy for doing stuff that you're now seen as not committed to your professional role because you're trying to juggle, you know, being a parent, versus, for me, when my kids were younger, and I would choose to go sort of see their, you know, chorale event or whatever, like, what a Renaissance guy. I watched this also happen with a white male who was a champion of diversity. He got promoted. The first woman came into his role, and she now had a very different response by not just the men in that organization, but everybody, where if she didn't match what Mike did, she was not committed to the cause. And if she did, she was seen as self-seeking and you know, self-promoting. And so that dilemma I've never faced. No one's ever accused me of pandering to self-interest when I'm passionate about issues of inclusion, because they don't expect it. So I get a lot more privilege and leeway, which is one of the ways I've used that honorably, to show up in C-suite and to work with people that are like me. So I would say just do what you did, keep talking about it, and notice that for what's viewed as one as courageous, you're saying, well, I can't even, that's not courageous. I get a different word for that. to be able to bring that to the consciousness of all of us. And this isn't about what do we do with that. It's just like yes and yes. It's valid, it's real. The fact that you're willing to share it publicly in a large space of 450 intimate new friends, it's important to hear that. It's important to hear that voice. So thanks for at least that one little instance of that. Let's go one more here. Okay.
Hi,
Thank
my
you.
name is Marquita Jackson, and I'm with PCC Global Institute. My question is what advice can you give to white men with completely different ideals and backgrounds on how to mentor women and people of color on the issues that are often unique to them?
So the question is, what advice would you give the white men about how to mentor women and other people of color about, did I hear that right?
Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, recognize that I can't, the advice that I give you is tainted with, Bill's spin of the world. So first of all, I got to recognize what it might be like for you. I think for me, what's more important even than mentoring is sponsorship. So I always like to say, I'm exhibit A of this whole myth about that I see come up all the time when inclusion gets real traction. It always comes up like that means we're not going to promote the best person. I said, so when is it that you thought that we've already been doing that? I'm exhibit A. I've never been the best candidate for any job I've ever gotten. I've been really good, but I usually had someone that believed in my ability and sponsored me before I saw it myself. And so for me, the best part of mentoring is basically being able to block some of the interference so that you and others are actually being able to sort of show up, and not just show up, but then be able to sort of be there when you start to get different reactions, back to your earlier question, where the actions that I tell you to do, thinking that you're an honorary white guy, which is insulting, right? Because you're not. When you do that, it gets met very differently. Long answer, I've got 2 African-American women in the last 10 years, and there's a lot more of this, who have talked about performance feedback they get being told that they don't smile enough. Right? This probably resonates with a lot of you. No one has ever given me feedback that I don't smile enough related to what I deliver on. And both of these women took that to heart because they wanted to be able to be promotable and to be able to be employable. And they thought it was important feedback. So being able to interrupt some of that, that's my job, to interrupt that stuff, to say, hey, what's that have to do with what the deliverables are here? So I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but I would say, what is it that, ask you a lot of questions. What do you want to do, and how can I help you? How can I support you to do that? As opposed to let me teach you to sort of act like me, which infinitely won't work, from my humble perspective. So thank you. Thank you very much. And,
Could I just ask what, I'm still here. I have a question.
Oh, there, okay.
Hi, my name is Elvia Pacheco Flores, and I represent part of the growing Hispanic Latino community in Greenville. And one quick question, talking about diversity is always so difficult. And I just wanted to know if, by being a Caucasian, I guess this applies to all other Caucasian males in the group, have you guys ever felt like that if you bring up diversity, you would then be viewed as an outcast, as the redheaded stepchild, as they usually say, by bringing up diversity gaps, specifically those around race?
Well, the short answer is yes, of course. I mean, I have friends that won't talk to me anymore about the work that I do, but I made a long time decision saying they're not really friends. I mean, and it's not that we have to agree. I've got a lot of people that still don't understand what the heck that I do and why it's important for me personally. So part of that is you gotta just sort of what's important to me. So for me, it's what's my mutual self-interest, and I don't fully understand that yet, but I'm on that. That's a journey that's never gonna end. So why is it that I do this? This is important. It allows me to stay grounded. So because this is really turbulent stuff, right? But I'm coming late to the party because, as a colleague of mine said, black man who lives in Atlanta after the election, and again, I don't mean to politicize this, but he was saying, when a lot of other folks were like, what's going to happen? He was like, hey, welcome to my world. This has been going on for 30 years. Maybe you'll now get a little more, you meaning other whites will get a little more sort of clued in to sort of what some of the struggles are. So he said, we're going to be fine. And, but so it's like, we've got work to do. I have work to do, you have work to do, we have work to do together. Again, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.